If I were to ask you if salespeople are trustworthy, what would your first reaction be? I'm guessing not very positive. The delightful thing about my guest this week is that not only does he defy all sales stereotypes, but he's turned his authenticity and vulnerability into a superpower. Rather than hide who he is, Peter is encouraging others to do the same through his brand of authentic sales. But Peter didn't always have this clarity of purpose, and what makes his story so inspiring is how he turned a pattern of personal setbacks into the motivation to change his life trajectory. It's an understatement to say that he's passionate about the art of selling, but even if the corporate or software world isn't familiar to you, I'd really invite you to listen to the personal story behind the work context. Peter is admirable in his self-reflection, and the lessons he's learned are a gift to anyone with a feeling that their work is out of alignment with who they are. Let's dive right in as Peter is describing the painful context around why he decided to leave his last corporate job and bet on himself by going out on his own.
I left my company where I was VP of sales. I joined when they were a seed stage company. It was the first company that I joined where actually they had basically $0 in revenue. Initially, I remember telling the CEO I have no interest in joining a startup, and it's extremely grueling, as you know. There's a lot of emotion that goes into it. At this particular company, I was waking up sometimes at 4:30 a.m. to talk to companies in Europe or Israel because we were a global company. And then I would sleep at like 11 or midnight and then start the whole cycle over again. And in between, I would be drinking wine, eating, because I have this habit of unfortunately like eating my emotions sometimes or eating in stressful situations. So I'd been through this journey, seed to Series B. I decided to join the company because I had such a great time working with the exec team at the time. We had a lot of former Dropbox folks who were on the team, and it just felt very organic, natural, felt like a team and a family and friends all working together at the same time. And I felt like I could truly show up as an authentic sales leader for the first time in my career because there was prior context to who I was. But the defining moment was when I decided to leave that company. And I decided to leave because there was doubt in my ability to scale with the company. I didn't know where the concern was coming from. Obviously we had set some pretty aggressive revenue targets and we didn't hit every single quarter, but we did have this impressive growth rate going from 0 to 5 in 2 years. But, I remember there was a one-on-one where my CEO said, you've never actually done the, let's say, 5 to 50, 100 million growth. And so that makes me a little bit nervous. And I remember telling him, like, this is a true statement. I've never gone from 5 to 100 to 200 million, but a lot of people haven't gone through that and can go through that for the first time and have a lot of success if they're thinking from first principles and leveraging, what they're great at with the right support system around them as well.
And so you're sitting at this dinner with your boss or the CEO at the time, and he's basically expressing doubts about kind of your abilities and your current job. What did that lead to in terms of how you decide to approach things going forwards?
I think what that triggered in me was, I think this stems from me kind of always being the underdog in both like personal and professional instances. And I've always had to prove myself more, I felt like, than my peers. Right, at Dropbox, I closed the first enterprise logos. And I remember feeling frustrated because I didn't think that was valued to the extent that I thought it should have been. And I remember kind of looking at folks in a similar position who weren't doing as well, kind of numbers wise in terms of closing sales and still getting like a promotion path, let's say, or still getting applauded for, carving the path for enterprise at Dropbox. And I think because this happened time and time again, Slack, similar thing, right? I got in there, they were like, prove to us that you can close deals, and then, you're going to get that management position that you had at Dropbox. Close a bunch of deals, and then I didn't get that opportunity because my VP at the time said I didn't have enough white hairs, which meant I didn't have enough experience. And so here I am in a similar situation where there's doubt from a senior figure after I had proven that I could lead a team, not before. It's not like I was asking for a chance to grow with the company and I had not done much or hadn't made an impact. I had already made the impact that I had made. I was telling you, like, the early mornings, the late nights, and my personal friends would always tell me, "You work harder than anybody that I know." And so your path is always to get frustrated by leadership because we don't think your leaders or your managers or the companies you work for understand that. So that's what it triggered, is this kind of like, okay, here we go again. I've put in my soul, my life. I've almost given up certain portions of my personal life. I'd gained a ton of weight, all for wanting to prove that I could help grow this cybersecurity company from zero to whatever. But unfortunately, what was perceived on the other end were gaps. And that, really triggered me because it just felt like the same old story over again. And I almost was disappointed in myself too, believing that it would be a different story this time around. But here I was having it, played out in the same way.
Just listening to you, it's like it's hard to hear. It's like feeling like you're making such big sacrifices, right? Not only effort on the job, but then sacrifices in your personal life, and then having that not be recognized for whatever the reason was. What did you decide to do with that? How did you decide to change things?
Yeah, so what I decided was, first of all, not to react too negatively in that dinner. Obviously, I was very upfront about how disappointed I was. And by the way, the conversation was, "Hey, Peter, I want you to lead partnerships." Because like, the CEO really valued me as an early exec and he wanted me to stay at the company. And he told me, the culture is very much impacted by you, love your energy, and you could do a lot of different things. So run partnerships for me.
And how did you feel about running partnerships?
I didn't feel great because, it was definitely conveyed as an opportunity. Like, oh, you're going to be closing. They're like, it's the same thing as sales. It's just mega sales. And you're going to be flying around with one of our board members, was a very notable figure in Hollywood. So they were like, you're going to be working these partnerships with this person. It's a huge career opportunity. But what I felt as I was being conveyed to me was, I'm not like 25 anymore, right? I'm not 22. I'm not a spring chicken. I was 37 at the time. And what I was thinking was, if I were going to make a career shift, I would have done it probably sooner. And partnerships, sure, there are parallels to sales. But what I told him was, what happens if I actually do well in partnerships? Are you going to tell me I've never done partnerships before and then find somebody else to replace me then? And then where does that leave me? So I felt almost, it felt like the wool was being pulled over my eyes, and I knew it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it also sounds like, from what you're describing, that you also must have felt very misunderstood.
Very misunderstood. Yeah, because sales was my career. And so to have somebody say, we're going to shift you out of the career that you built for yourself over the last 15 years I felt disrespected. Misunderstood is a good word too, and confused.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing that strikes me as you're saying this is going back to what you were saying earlier about feeling like you're the underdog. It actually makes me wonder, when you think about being the underdog, did you, in the past or even in that moment, do you ever felt like you chose to take the underdog role, or do you feel like it was assigned to you?
I think actually in a lot of ways I chose that path too. I think it was intentional. I love an underdog story. I love folks who were given very little but can turn it into something very special and magical. And I'll give you some very tangible examples. At Google, I started selling AdWords, but I was gravitated towards the TV ads team when it was very unformed and a very new concept. And I liked the feeling of going into a meeting and trying to unseat the incumbent, which at the time was traditional TV agencies when Google TV ads was getting into that space. And Google TV ads failed, by the way. Now like there's YouTube ads and all of that, but they were actually trying to get traditional television commercials run through an auction system. So I like that risk. And then at Dropbox, I purposely wanted to be the first person to try and get into enterprise because, and you and I both know this very well because we worked together on some of the first deals. Oftentimes we'd actually get laughed out of rooms. Like people would not take us seriously and we had to keep a straight face. And so I do think I chose that path in my career choices. And I also do think I choose to align with those types of people in my personal life. And even when I'm hiring as a VP of sales, I sought candidates who had that edge and grit because they were underdogs or outsiders or, misunderstood at some point in their life.
When I'm hearing you talk about this, it's almost like you're putting yourself in positions where you wanted a chance to really prove you could over deliver.
Yes.
And then hearing the story of like, well, time and time again, people are like, no, they're going to choose somebody else. I could really see that hurting.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think I've definitely been scarred by it, right? Which is why I own my own business now. And I think you put it very well. I do feel like I've overperformed at most junctures in my career, but people don't see the amount of effort and work and the discipline that it takes to overperform.
And the sacrifices.
Yes. And almost in one or two moments, they discard that. Right. And that I think is like a jarring thing. It's like, wow, like here is this history, like this, portfolio of doing things that are unnatural. In startups, people say that you have to do things that are unnatural. And I felt like I had to do that at most junctures in my career to succeed and stick out. But then in an instant, somebody can say something to you and completely disregard that. And then you're sitting there wondering, how has this been missed? How have people not seen me running through walls to get things done?
Yeah, what you're saying about sort of startups requiring unnatural things, obviously you don't mean that literally, but I think anyone in the startup world will recognize that as being like, yeah, you've got to really over-deliver because it's actually a crazy thing starting a company and making it successful on the timelines that venture capital expects. So when I hear that, I'm like, yeah, like it does require a huge sacrifice. What that makes me wonder about what you did next actually was, what role did that play in like your next decision in terms of the alignment you chose between your work and then how natural or unnatural it felt to you?
Yeah. So I think there were two things that were clear in that moment. One is that I had the confidence that I work harder than anybody else. Right? I was like, you know what? There's really not anyone I think who can outwork me. And then the second thing is, I knew at that moment I cannot report to somebody else. I can't give the responsibility of my growth to somebody else because time and time again, those folks have disappointed me. And so that's how that moment impacted me. Those were like the two non-negotiables now. One is that like I was going to use my hard work for something that I could reap the benefits of, not a company. And then the second thing was I also didn't want to have a formal boss over me who would eventually probably disappoint me. Not in terms of like learning things or growth, but just being understood as a human, right? Which, as you know, knowing me is extremely important in somebody I'm going to hitch my wagon to.
Yeah, and I think part of what I'm hearing is like in being understood, it's then also being recognized, and then having that recognition turn into some kind of advancement at a company, which is, that's how companies work, right?
Totally, yeah. And I, personally, I'm a words of affirmation guy. Like my wife kind of makes fun of me for this because she has to like carve out ways to, tell me I'm doing a good job. And when I don't get it, I feel it, right? And it's the same thing in kind of a corporate setting, right? I just want folks to understand and recognize the effort it takes to do these unnatural things or to help companies grow in a way that, will make them proud.
Well, one thing just to reflect back to you is that in making a choice to go work for yourself, like the way that you're talking about it, I see so much clarity in like what was important to you. And I think not a lot of people have that type of clarity, but I think the thing that I'm also like really curious about is like, it's one thing to have that clarity, but it's another thing to actually go do something about it. What was that process like of deciding like, no, I know this is what's right for me. I'm going to go do this. Like, how did you actually start going about that?
So I've always seen myself as a teacher and a mentor. And so even when I had full-time jobs, I would always tell the company that I likely will advise one or two or three companies, not in a way that overtakes my job, but advice that maybe comes once or twice a month. And so I was always practicing that side of my brain. So what happened in this instance was because I was advising a couple companies casually, I knew that if I were to tell them I was going to plan to leave, that potentially there was a chance they would bring me on as a formal consultant, more in like the 5 to 10 hours a week level. And so after that dinner, I just started putting my feelers out there, to say, hey, like, do you need a consultant? Do you need more involvement? And luckily, a lot of the folks I was giving advice to already raised their hands and said, yes, I would definitely take you up on that offer. Even though it feels like definitely the decision point was a very poignant moment. But after the decision, I did have to make a very calculated decision based off conversations I was warming up. So, just like in sales, I was building my pipeline essentially.
What did it feel like to make that decision?
It felt so liberating. Oh my gosh. Like it felt like 1,000-pound weight lifted off my shoulder. And I felt so much happier. Like I was a much better husband and father. I had a pep in my step. And to realize that you finally get the chance to bet on yourself is like the most liberating feeling ever. A lot of folks actually I remember would be like, aren't you scared? Like, are you going to be able to make enough money? I guess you always have the sales job as a safety net, right? You could always join like a Snowflake or Databricks, or you could probably join Dropbox again if you wanted to. And those comments fell on such deaf ears because there was no other choice for me. Like that wasn't a backup plan for me. If the business didn't work, I actually don't know what I would do, but definitely wouldn't be like going to be a VP of sales somewhere or going to be a senior account executive making tons of money. For me, it was a lifestyle choice, a bet, like I said, I was making on myself, and it was going to be the only bet I was going to make for the rest of my life in my mind.
We've spoken a number of times over the last like 18 months, and I'm always have been so impressed of like your conviction. And I'm wondering like where does that come from like within you? I don't think this is common. I don't think everybody has the same level of like self-conviction that you've been talking about.
I think this level of conviction comes from the fact that every time I've had success in my career or in my life, there's always been a risk I've had to take. Even when I was in college at Stanford, I didn't even think I would join the cheerleading team. Like that sounds like crazy, right? But it ended up becoming like such an integral part of my experience at Stanford. And I'm now proud of it, where initially I was like not sure where it was going to lead me. So I think that's part of it. I've taken all these risks that have turned out to be really good bets. And it's the only way I know how to live my life is to draw outside the lines. I think the other thing is, this is getting into very personal, but my sister died by suicide right before my senior year in college. And it's still very traumatic to relive those moments. But it sounds cliche to say this, but life is so fleeting and short. You never know what you're not going to have. And so I have this sense, and maybe sometimes it's unhealthy pressure. I have this feeling that I have to take my bets, because who knows when you're not going to have the opportunity. And I felt that obviously very viscerally with like losing my sister in a given, in a heartbeat essentially. And I don't want to live my life with regrets. And I think maybe that comes off as conviction to some. For me, it's just I want to try as many things as possible and to try and live as fulfilling of a life as possible. And the only way I know how to do that is to act on things that I think about.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine, a sibling taking their own life, but it sounds like from the way you just described it, actually you're doing a lot to honor her.
Yeah, trying to, and like, my parents as well, they've been through a lot. And, again, like sometimes it can come up in unhealthy ways, I would say. It's not all like inspirational, but I do want a better life moving forward. And I want to give a better life for my wife, my kid, and like not have something like that stall me, but help like fuel the fire around trying to create a better life.
How long did it take to come to that realization, like what you just described?
It probably took until a couple years ago, to be honest, because that's when I like truly decided to go off on my own. But I think it was a series of trial and tribulation, and so I don't regret the obstacles I've gone through, because if I would have, for example, left Dropbox and then created my own business, I also wouldn't have experience. So I do think it was like a lead up to the moment where I left my last gig. And again, I'm like thankful for all the like stints I've had, even though a lot of them have ended in this disappointment. They still have given me a lot of skill sets and perspective to be able to share with founders now. So that's what I would say. I think it's a kind of lifetime of obstacles, pain, and going through disappointment after disappointment.
Well, I think also the way that people respond to you, I think as a role model, I think reflects that. I think you're so good at taking every experience that you've had and then figuring out, of course, like handling whatever's hard about it at the time, but then just figuring out, well, like what has this taught me? And I hadn't thought about this before, but that seems to me to like really tie into what you're saying about your passion about being like a mentor or a teacher.
Yeah. I'm super passionate about that, especially because I feel like there's a lack of transparency in Silicon Valley. There's like a lack of real talk. And so I love it when mentees come to me and I share stories like this. And a lot of, I think, folks in my shoes would choose not to share this type of story because they're afraid of the backlash. And it's kind of tied into like when I started posting about Asians in tech too, because I do feel like there's a huge gap in leadership and the perception of Asians being strong business leaders. Like when I started writing about that, there were folks who were like surprised because a lot of them had thought the same thing, but they were afraid of backlash. And so that is what I try to give to my mentees too, is like, don't be afraid of the backlash. Like if somebody who has been in tech for a while is willing to kind of share with a stranger, what they've been through, like the pains, then, you should also have the confidence that this is not an uncommon thing, like what we're going through.
The other side of that as well is I'm sure there's a lot of people, you tell me, but I'm sure a lot of people must have said, oh, I didn't know that you felt that way.
Yes.
That to me, it's like another great example of the power of like vulnerability. It's like when you talk about what your actual experience is, then my experience personally has been almost every time someone is like, I have gone through exactly the same thing.
Yes, that's such a good point because it's like you're sharing another layer of yourself that was so core to who you were at the time. Yeah, a lot of people at Dropbox were like, yeah, I never knew you were struggling because you're always like smiling and saying hi. But deep down inside, I had a lot of dark moments at all these companies I've been at. It wasn't always great. And most of the time it was actually like very hard.
How did you handle some of those like dark moments? I mean, what did you do with that?
Unfortunately, sometimes I would drink way too much, and a lot of times I think people would see me as like the party person at Dropbox. I remember when I was opening up the New York office, I was like entertaining guests almost like every day of the week. Be like, oh, I'm only here for like Sunday and Monday, so let's go out on Sunday. And I think, I'm also a people pleaser, so I would kind of get into that mode of like, okay, let me drink away like my sorrows. This is what salespeople do. They're at bars hanging out, but outwardly, people probably thought I was really social. So that was like one unhealthy way I was dealing with it. Another way I was dealing with it was that I was probably like overly transparent with my customers. You know, you and I talk about Lenny Bloom from NBC, and I think this is actually a positive, or like Chris Ducuso from News Corp. Every time I would close a deal, I felt that I needed that again, like words of affirmation to see what I had done well in the deal cycle. And so I think it was actually like therapeutic for me to ask, like, what was it like working with me? And most of the times folks would say like, I remember, really learning about your culture, your identity, the whole Korean barbecue thing. I laugh about it now, but I do think it made a huge impact on a lot of customers who didn't see that side of culture, right? In like a sales cycle. And then the other thing like folks would say is like, you're the fastest rep to get back to me. So that validated a lot of like, okay, I'm working really hard. My health maybe was declining a little bit because I was drinking so much and waking up early and going to bed at night. But it's turning out to be actually a positive for these clients. And it is probably one of the reasons why they really trusted me as a rep. And so I think those were kind of some ways I was dealing with it. One in an unhealthy way, with all the drinking, but then I just sought connection with my customers in a way that maybe I wouldn't have if I were, a standard enterprise rep.
You were saying, you're talking about how social you are. I think most people would say you're probably one of the most social people that they know, which I think is still true, but it sounds like in those moments, like maybe you're sacrificing yourself a little bit too much. Everybody has limits, and still looking for, if I sacrifice myself enough, if I respond instantly at every hour of the day, will these customers validate that effort? Right? You're just looking for it in different places.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, it was great to just to build on that. It was great to have that validation from customers. But again, with the disappointment, I don't think folks at Dropbox truly knew how hard I was working, and definitely I didn't feel like that from the new leadership that came in, which ultimately led to me leaving because I didn't feel recognized or valued on the parts that I spiked, which is like human connection, hard work, and, really trying to be customer first in a way where these companies, I think, were comfortable, sticking their neck out for us.
When you decided to go off in this new direction where, as we were talking about, you had this like very strong self-conviction. You mentioned a little bit about this in terms of how people around you reacted, but could you say a little bit more about like how your support network reacted positively, negatively, neutrally to what you were doing?
Yeah, so most of my close friends were extremely happy for me, and they felt like this was a long time coming, actually, where it just made sense to them because they knew kind of a lot of the frustration that had been built up, over years of being in the corporate side of things. I think that was awesome to see my friends really validate the move. With folks who were in my network, like I said, there was a little bit of misunderstanding, around like what I was doing. Actually, a lot of folks thought I was consulting to take a break or to have a lifestyle that was really cushy. They thought I was going to be hanging out at the country club half a day and, still raking in as much money as I did at the startup, which also wasn't my goal, right? My goal wasn't to, chill, right? And then other folks thought that this was like an intermission to be like, oh, okay, I get it. You're a consultant, right? Which I don't consider myself a consultant. I consider myself a coach and in the process of building a brand. Whereas I think like consultants are focused on selling their hours and then potentially going in-house somewhere. So a lot of folks who reached out to me who are also thinking about consulting wanted to know about that path. It's like, okay, how do I use this to get my next job? And so there was like some misunderstanding there where I was like, this is like not at all what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to build almost like a media company. I'm trying to actually build content that can impact a lot of people. And I want to teach and mentor people and coach people, not consult people on the way to something else. Like this is my end destination. And so I think that was interesting to deal with. And I still deal with it today. Less so, I would say, because now I have a lot more content out there. So I think people kind of see my work and understand what I'm trying to do. But initially that was an interesting thing to wade through.
Yeah, I mean, in that sort of like era of confusion, I could see a lot of people listening right now thinking like just feeling fear in that period of like, oh my God, like what are people going to think and all the kind of stuff. And given like what we were just talking about earlier, I mean, how did you handle it differently that time and feeling all that sort of misunderstand your confusion from people?
There definitely was a lot of fear. Yeah, like showing up as my full self and kind of conveying my plans. But what I decided to do was one of the things, another non negotiable actually, that I didn't tell you about when I was going off on my own, is to be my full self all the time. So that meant like, for the first time in my career, I was comfortable saying this isn't my path. That is actually not what I'm trying to do. Whereas in the past, I would try and fit myself into and be like a chameleon and people please. But for the first time, I'm telling people, no, this is my vision. I'm not like an influencer or like a big content creator yet, but I would love to be that. Right. And I'm on the path to doing that. And I may fail. I would say this all the time, by the way. I'd be like, I may fail. I might not have enough clients, or maybe I'm not a great coach, but I'm going to take my shot at it. And so I think understanding that I'm going to show up as my full self and having that also be a non-negotiable, like put the pressure off in these conversations to be somebody that I'm not. And it was awesome. It was like a relief, but it also, I realized, started becoming something where people felt like they were being educated about this kind of way of growing your business as a solopreneur and trying to like do media plus coach plus establish your personal brand. Like I feel like I started getting a lot of interest around that, and that gave me a lot of energy. But it did take like several conversations of telling people this is not what I'm doing, or like that is not what I'm doing, to now start to get there where like most conversations, people don't ask me really if I'm a consultant. They ask me how I coach.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, just to mirror for you a little bit, like I just hear so much clarity from you. I think it's really fascinating. Again, I think I'm going to press the point a little bit more, because I just think that there's something really important that people can take away from this conversation, which is, I probably don't really need to explain. I just think it's really difficult sometimes. People are really not like, what is it that I really want to do in life, even if it's just for 5 or 10 years. And I really want to understand more deeply, like how you connected with that within yourself.
So there's a few things that I want to accomplish in life. So one is I want to be excited getting up every day, and I want to go where the energy is generating for me, not draining for me. And then two is, in order for that to happen, I feel like I need to focus in on an area where I have an outsized advantage compared to other folks in my position. And so for me in my personal life, I know that what is energy generating for me is helping people articulate what they want to say using authentic phrasing. And so that was the cornerstone, and that was the entry point for every single coaching engagement that I would go into, because it was a lot of fun for me. I got a lot of fulfillment, and there's not a lot of people focusing on it. There's not a lot of people who are going to come to you and say, forget about the sales frameworks for right now. Let's just talk about building sales confidence in you and how you're saying what you're saying. And those like 3 words that you said could have been said like this. And how did I realize that was a superpower? I was thinking about this, and now I talk about this more publicly, but English was my second language. And because as a kid, I was so insecure about speaking English, even like in a lunchtime conversation, I obsessed over how to phrase the English language. And so I've been a student of the English language in a much deeper way than even native English speakers, because I wanted to understand the mechanics and the emotions at the same time. Because emotionally, I didn't want to feel insecure about speaking English. Mechanically, I wanted to come off as extremely polished as a young enterprise sales rep at Google and Dropbox. And so when I realized that, I was like, wow, I've actually been working towards this my entire life. So that's the advice I would give people, is like, what have you been working towards your entire life that you didn't even know, where you have an outsized advantage? Because I don't believe, this is controversial, but I don't believe, or maybe it is controversial, I don't know, but I don't believe you can just pick up a skill and then suddenly be the best at it overnight. I believe that you need to monetize a skill set that you've been working on since basically you were born. And I know that sounds silly because a lot of us haven't been working since we were born, but there are elements of your life that are training you towards something where you can impact the world better than anybody else. And that's kind of the clarity that I guess I am trying to embody right now. Is like, there's so many sales coaches, ton of them. It's like, because of all this, like what I was telling you, like consultants, people being burnt out at their job. So I always think about how can I go against the grain to do something long term that I already enjoy, that I do instinctively, that nobody else is doing. That's also something where I get up every morning and I'm like, I'm excited to teach people about this.
I think it's a super interesting like point of view. It's like this idea of paraphrasing, what is the thing you've actually been working on your whole life, whether you knew it or not? So if someone came to you and said, like, I'm sure there's something, but I'm just not aware of what that thing is. Like I fall in the I'm not aware of it camp. What would your advice be to them? Like what should you pay attention to? How should you find it? Like what would you say?
I would get really tactical and think about the week, the day, the month, and write down or even just mentally think through look at your calendar maybe, right? If you put everything in your calendar and think through what activities were really exciting for me, right? Like when was I the happiest? And I think a lot can be said once you start going through that. And even like personal hobbies, like, I'm a basketball junkie. I love playing basketball. So I actually just like last year or earlier this year, I held a clinic with a really talented basketball coach and brought together like 15 Asian men to be coached by a basketball coach and that was very energy generating for me.
When you think about that, maybe think is actually exactly the wrong verb. Like, what does it feel like if you could describe for you when you're engaged in things that give you energy versus things that drain your energy? Like, what do you notice?
What I notice is, again, because I'm a words of affirmation guy, I know I keep coming back to that. Like the coaching sessions where people are like, I've never heard this before. Or, wow, like I can imagine actually saying that on a call. Or, can you repeat what you just said? That's like really interesting. I know it sounds very like tactical, but these are the things on coaching calls that give me energy because then I know how much of an impact I'm having. Or, in sales, obviously, it's not just about how you feel, it's about the results. But when my clients are like, wow, I closed that deal and I couldn't have closed that deal without your support, that's extremely energy generating, right? Or now I have a digital course. When people reach out to me who are complete strangers and are like, that course like made a huge impact on getting an internship. I'm like, wow, like when you see the proof points of impact, that is energy generating. And I don't know how that can't be for anybody, right? Who's a human being.
If I paraphrase you a little bit, it's really seeing that what you're doing is of value and it's made an impact on somebody. And for you, might not be the same for everybody, but for you, that generates this energy. And like that energy, like does it feel like something? Like, I don't know if you had to describe it, like what does it feel like?
Oh, wow. I mean, it feels like you're winning an award. you know, it feels like you're being honored for who you are as a person because it's so like instinctive to me. In coaching sessions where it's the most fun, it's stuff that I just kind of know innately, but is so novel to other people. And so it feels very natural and authentic, organic. I know I use authentic a lot, but it just feels like a ton of authentic, organic energy where you don't have to try so hard to force fit something into somebody else's mind. That is, I think, where I love to operate because you're a product of your own experience.
Well, and I think just to like tie some of these things together, like you were apologizing for saying the word authentic so much. I don't think you should because it's just so obvious, like how much of a core value that is for you. And I think what's so energy giving about listening to you talk about everything is how clear you are about what's important to you, and then how focused you are on making sure that you honor like what's important to you. And I think those are just such great lessons for anybody just getting through this thing we call life.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and maybe part of the reason why I apologize for it is a lot of folks are using the word authentic now, by the way. I don't know if you've noticed, right? Like every single like LinkedIn influencer who's like, this is how you grow your audience. It's like, you have to be authentic. And maybe like part of me is apologizing on their behalf because sometimes I cringe reading those posts. I'm like, you don't really know what it's like to be authentic until you have the mindset that you're going to show up as your full self every single day, every single minute. And that's just extremely hard to do, And I'm still learning how to do that, but I'm trying to do that. And this actually podcast is perfect for that because I've said a lot of things that I've never said before in like a quote unquote public forum. So I appreciate you for that.
Well, again, and I think there's a courage to that. And I don't think you should underplay it at all. I think there's real courage in showing up as your authentic self. And I think, as you've already said, it actually gives you great returns. And so hopefully I think you're embodying this role of yourself as a teacher, as a mentor, because I think you're showing what happens when you actually just show up as yourself and just talk about being authentic, but you actually are authentic.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, you're the only person in the world that's you, right? So you can't shortchange that in any scenario, whether it's personal or work.
What is some advice that you would give someone who finds himself at a similar juncture where they're feeling like their daily work is misaligned with like who they are? Like what advice would you give them?
I would carve out as much time for things that are outside that work as humanly possible without getting fired, right? And try a bunch of things, because I think there's no guarantee that the first idea that you think about is going to work, or the first way in which you show up for yourself will work. The other thing I think about in terms of life is it's a giant experiment. You can't truly know where to land unless you try and execute on things. And so that would be my advice, is like carve out some time for yourself, like spend 1 or 2 hours less a day feeding into the toxicity that is leading to burnout, and run these mini experiments to see which experiment is energy generating and which aren't, that you thought were going to be energy generating, and figure out a way to hack that process for yourself.
Yeah, when I'm hearing that is it's also just like be curious. Really try to pay attention to yourself, like what actually resonates with you and what doesn't, and actually not try, but actually honor it.
Yeah, exactly. And, I've heard like a couple people have said, oh, like, are you sure you want to do all these things? Are you sure you want to write a book? You're doing a boot camp for founders. You're trying to do a digital course. You are also coaching. Like, your audience might get a little bit confused. And I thought about it. And my answer to that is like, I don't care about my audience being confused, right? Like, I'm trying to find clarity for myself. You know what I'm saying? And so the way that I find clarity for myself is to try a bunch of things, because sometimes I surprise myself too, on like what is actually going to be fun for me. And so that's what I would suggest to other people too, because I do think there is like a stalling of action because of what you think people will perceive with the experiments you're running, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. And because the other side of it is it's extremely fun to try all these different things. Like, I didn't know what it was like to run a boot camp. Now I do. It was one of the things I actually got burnt out on, so now I'm not doing it. But do I care about whether or not there's continuity in that? No, because I learned a ton. And that was a jumping off point for my digital course, right? I'm writing a book. Initially, I was like, how is this going to work, right, with my schedule? But I've just enjoyed the process. Do I care about how many books are going to get sold? Of course I do. But am I prepared for being a failure? Of course I am. So I think like that's the kind of mentality that I would love to share with folks, is like, don't worry about anybody else except for yourself, because you focusing on yourself will help other people.
I love that. I think the other thing that I hear in that question that you got from people about whether people be confused or not is I also hear their own fear. And something that I heard a while ago, I don't remember when this was, a few years ago, I think, that really, really resonated with me, and then it's kind of coming up for me right now, is when you ask someone for advice, they are always going to give you the advice they would have given themselves. And I love that, because it just highlights that we all are separate individuals and we have our own experiences, and no one can ever, with 100% completeness, ever understand your experience and therefore give you the best advice for you.
Totally.
And I know the question is an advice, but there's kind of advice built into that, which is like, are you sure you want to do this confusing thing?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And which is why I also say, when I give advice, sometimes I find myself saying you're a product of your own experience. You've heard me say it a couple times on this podcast too, because it's very true. And so you have to take even my advice with a grain of salt, right? Because what has impacted me in the way that is successful could be very different to you. So I'm just speaking from where I've had success and where I feel like it's been a fulfilling life, but everybody has a different path too. So that's why my advice is try a bunch of things.
You think you sharing just so honestly and authentically like what your experience has been allows other people to receive it in a way that's really well calibrated, right? So it's not just you saying like this is the only way to leave a frustrating, work situation, and then go off on your own and do a bunch of things, but it's the way you did it. And I just have to really thank you for just being so honest and authentic and genuine in the way you've conveyed it, because I think it really helps people understand like where you're coming from. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. Well, it's a two-way street. I can't divulge this type of information with somebody I don't trust. And so you've created an amazing environment for me to share my story and to relive both like some of the traumatic, but also like the good moments too. And I think that's the reality of life. There's plenty of both, that everybody's dealing with.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. And take good care of yourself, Peter.
Yeah, let's do this again, maybe in a year.
Sounds good. Yeah, love to see where you are, what new experiments you're running.
Yeah, exactly. Cool, man.
All right. Take care.
Take care.
What I Knew was created and edited by me, Alex Marshall, with production support from Katerina Podlesnaya. Theme music was composed by Sophia Wilhelmi, and podcast artwork was created by Dan Hollick. Special thanks to Farron Warner and to all of my guests for so generously sharing their time and stories with me. If you or someone you know has a story of change they'd like to share on the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at podcast@alexmarshall.me, that's alexmarshall.me, or via my website, alexmarshall.me. You can also find this information in the episode description.